Hello everyone, this is part 3 of the FLIMSY 3 weeks, and I want to speak today about something very strange that happens on Tisha Bav, and that is 2 practices we have because it's called no less than a mo'ed. And let's see what the practices are. The Shulchan Aruch paskins that Ein Omrim Tchina Erev Tisha Bav Mishum De'ikrei Moed. You don't say Tachanun on Erev Tisha Bav because it's called a Moed. And if it comes out on Shabbos like it does this year, you don't say Tzitkatcha at Mincha. Going on to Sunday, the actual day of Tisha Bav, comes the Shulchan Aruch and says, En Omrim Tachanun b'Tisha Bav v'en noflim al pneihem Mishum De'ikrei Moed. Indeed, you don't say Tachanun on Tisha Bav because it's called a Moed. So what is this Moed? And we happen to find 2 different interpretations as to why it's called a moed. The Gemara actually says explicitly, this moed is a terrible thing. The Gemara says in Maseches Tainis that ultimately on Tisha B'Av it was the anniversary of Chet HaMeraglim, the sin of the spies, and then the Gemara goes into a whole question of dates, and it basically says that that particular Tammuz was a full month, namely 30 days. They added an extra day, so that indeed the day that the spies would sin would be Tisha B'Av. In the words of the Gemara, Tammuz dehahi shata milvei milei. In other words, it was a full Tammuz, 30 days and not 29 days. Dichtiv kara alai moed lishbor bachurai. Quoting the pasuk from Eicha, that God called the day in order to break the boys, namely to break the Jewish people. God specifically made this date so that Tisha B'Av would fall out when it did. So at the end of the day, Moed means God made Rosh Chodesh a 2-day Rosh Chodesh in order for Tisha B'Av to be the ultimate day of the sin. In the words of Rashi, Tammuz de Shiloch Meraglim Milei Havlalei. Tammuz was a full 30-day month. V'chalu arba'im Dideu b'Tisha B'Av, the 40 days that they went and they came back ended on Tisha B'Av. V'hukla lahem b'chia v'darot v'yom mibur hachodesh kri moed. 30-day Tammuz, that was called a moed. Not exactly very good for the Jewish people. Having said that, the Shul Chilkas Yaakov, of Yaakov Breisher, who lived in the 20th century, was ultimately the rabbi in Zurich, comes along and says that it doesn't make sense. If Moed is such a terrible thing, then why do we skip Tachanun? And therefore, he basically comes to the conclusion that the pasuk in Eicha Kara Alai Moed must have a pshat and a drash. Namely, it must have a simple interpretation, and then the rabbis added their additional level of interpretation. The simple interpretation is that it is a moed, a happy day, and the rabbis came up with this other interpretation that we just said regarding the 30-day month, making Tisha B'Av the anniversary of the sin of the spies. In his words, B'Av Mikrei Moed ve'Yom Tov v'Shneihem Emet, Ze al pi drash ve'Ze al pi pshat. So, at the end of the day, we have a halacha. You don't say Tachanun on Tisha B'Av. Why? Everyone agrees because it's called a moed. What we don't agree about is what moed means. Does it mean something bad? Namely, this making Rosh Chodesh a 2-day Rosh Chodesh so that Tisha B'Av would be the ultimate day of the sin bad? Or no, it's actually what moed usually means. When we say mo'adim l'simcha, we mean a yontiv. Where does this come to pray? It comes to pray on why we don't say Tachanun. So comes along the Shayarei Knesset Hagdola, Rav Benabishti, who was the rabbi in Izmir, and he ultimately says, I'll tell you why you don't say Tachanun on Tisha B'Av. In Shomrim Kinot, V'hareim Kavilim Benizufim, Eino min haroi lishot Tachanunim v'limpol al pneihem, shelo lagbir mitat adin, kemo shehu hatam be'evel. In a word, we don't say Tachanun in a Shiva home, because midat adin, namely the very harsh judgment of God, is on the Shiva home, so we don't want to start confessing for sins in such an environment. Same thing on Tisha B'Av. It's a terrible day. We don't say Tachanun. That's what the word moed means, namely the negative moed. But it seems like most did not say that. For example, the Birkei Yosef, the Chida, Hagaon, Harav Chaim Yosef David Azulai, who wrote endless books in his many frequent travels, buried on Hara Menuchot, Rad the Chida comes along and quotes Midrashim. The Talmud Yerushalmi in Masechet Brachot brings a whole story about the day that the temple was destroyed, in which some Arab said to some Jew, "Hey, wake up, Mashiach was just born." Namely, the actual day in which Tisha Bav happened was the day Mashiach was born. And the Medrash Sutta on Eicha, and it says the same story, that a guy was plowing a field on that day of Tisha B'Av, and all of a sudden his ox stopped plowing. So he started to hit the ox wouldn't get up, until he heard a bat call and says, "Why are you hitting the ox? After all, the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed today." So he too ripped his shirt, got very, very upset, and eventually, after a few hours, this ox got up and started to work. He didn't understand. So finally, another heavenly voice came out and said, "Ki b'sha'ah zot nolad HaMashiach." Because of that, says the Birkei Yosef, the Chidah, that in the Sefer of the Ari, he brings a reason why it's so common on Tisha B'Av even to talk about comfort, such as not to say Tachanun. Why? Ki b'mincha Tisha B'Av nolad Mashiach, because at the mincha time of Tisha B'Av, Mashiach was born. This will explain the minhag in the Ramah, which Ashkenazim follow, that you say the word nachem, namely, you add the word comfort to your davening only at mincha, because that's when indeed Mashiach was born. Having said that, this will bring us to an absolutely outrageous minhag that, I have to admit, is not halachically accepted, but it is brought, meaning it was done, and that is brought in the Kolbel. The Kolbel says that on Tisha B'Av itself, because the day is called a Moed, women used to wash their hair, no more and no less. Mina kadum shanashim rachatzot roshan mina mincha velamala b'yom Tisha B'Av, v'haskenim harishonim zalin higu zeh v'letova nitkavnu. They actually did it for a good reason. In order to show that we believe that Mashiach was born on Tisha B'Av, they would wash their hair on Tisha B'Av. One of the 5 prohibitions of Tisha B'Av, they would violate, quote unquote, in order to show that Mashiach was born that day. And indeed, the Beit Yosef brings it and says it's absolutely outrageous, namely, Aminhagahu nishtakea velo nomar, and it should be totally forgotten for, and that's not what we should do. You could see how much the very fact that it's called a Moed has come in to our practice. Definitely no Tachanun, for 2 different reasons. But, quite frankly, you see that the reason, which is the positive reason, that this day will one day go into a Yontif, actually led to a minhag to defray from the prohibitions of Tisha B'Av. Namely, to wash yourself in order to show that Mashiach was born that day. So indeed, Tisha B'Av could be a terrible Moed, and there's reasons for it. But it also can be a wonderful day because that's the day Mashiach was born. And therefore, we have to balance the two. We don't say Tachanun. There was even a minhag to wash your hair, which is not halachically accepted, but it shows that Tisha B'Av has both in it, and it's indeed flimsy.